And now on BBC Radio 4, Sue MacGregor's guests look back at the contaminated blood disaster in which thousands of British haemophiliacs were infected with HIV and Hepatitis C in The Reunion.
It's been called one of the worst treatment disasters in the history of the NHS. In the 1970s and 80s, thousands of haemophiliacs in Britain suffering from the bleeding disorder were treated with blood products which carried potentially deadly viruses. 1,200 British haemophiliacs were unintentionally infected with HIV, the virus that leads to AIDS, at a time when little was known about the disease, and prospects for those infected looked grim. Thousands more contracted hepatitis C, an infectious and potentially fatal liver disease. It emerged that a new treatment developed in the United States, with potential to transform the lives of people living with haemophilia, was open to contamination. The NHS depended on imports of American blood products to make up the shortfall in its own supply. It was some years before the full scale of the disaster became clear. 3 decades on, there are still furious arguments over how the disaster was handled and about the level of support offered to survivors. In 2015, David Cameron apologised to victims on behalf of the British government, but calls for a full public inquiry continue.
Go! To look at these boys, every one of them severely haemophilic. Most of the time, it's not possible to recognise that they're genetically unequal.
Haemophilia is an inherited condition that affects the blood's ability to clot, as this documentary from the 1960s explained.
The result of a bleed into a joint can be painful in the extreme, permanently deforming and crippling.
When people ask me what haemophilia means, I answer that it's an everlasting bloody nuisance.
Frank Smith described living with the condition in this news report from 1970.
Being in a crowd can be particularly hazardous because the danger of people walking along with briefcases and other luggage, swinging them along quite violently sometimes, and it doesn't matter to other people, but to me it could be very serious, possibly even fatal.
Before 1965, the only treatment was bed rest and cold compresses.
This is blood which has just been donated at a blood transfusion centre and has been centrifuged.
Severe loss of blood was treated with a transfusion, but large volumes were required to achieve the necessary level of clotting.
It's this plasma that contains the essential clotting factor, Factor 8.
Researchers developed a treatment known as cryoprecipitate, which was rich in clotting factors.
Used to call it a bag of wee.
Mick Mason was among the first to benefit.
You have to have sort of 10, 12, 15 bags of it.
An even more concentrated form of clotting factors transformed life for haemophiliacs by the late 60s. Factor 8 concentrate was easy to transport and to administer at home.
Cold, sore throats at the moment.
Oh.
Each single dose of Factor 8 was pooled from multiple blood donations.
Any aspirin in the
But
last
Britain
one?
couldn't produce enough of the new treatment to meet demand, so started importing it.
Blood plasma from men like these is being used in Britain.
Unlike Britain's volunteer system, in America, blood donors were paid. In 1975, ITV's World in Action series investigated the blood plasma business in the US.
On the skid rows of several cities, we found that Highland's paid donors included many alcoholics and down-and-outs. Because of their lifestyle, many carry a high risk of passing on hepatitis, a serious liver disease.
Dr. David Owen, then the Health Minister, wanted an end to imported blood products.
I made the quite clear-cut decision that we had to go for self-sufficiency in the UK. I fought through the policy, and I announced it to Parliament, and I thought from that moment on it's fixed. What was shattering to me was to discover much later that we had not maintained the self-sufficiency policy, and it had been quietly dropped and Parliament had never been told.
Well, with me here in the studio to remember the blood contamination disaster and its impact are 5 people who were deeply involved. Colette Wintle, a rare female haemophiliac who contracted hepatitis from Factor 8 concentrates. David Waters, former chief executive of the Haemophilia Society. Dr. Peter Jones, who ran the Haemophilia Centre in Newcastle at the time. Jeanette Johnson, whose son Graham developed AIDS and sadly died at 15. And John, which is not his real name, who contracted HIV and hepatitis from treatment with Factor 8. I'd like to start by talking about life with haemophilia. Dr. Peter Jones, you had particular evidence of haemophilia in Newcastle.
I became a paediatrician, and one of the things that I came across very early was a young boy who was being brought up in the slums of what was then Scotswood Road in Newcastle with severe haemophilia. He had never been to school because of his bleeding. He was admitted to hospital sometimes twice a week, and that's what haemophilia was like. And the only thing we had to treat in those days was fresh frozen plasma, and if you gave too much of that, you drove somebody into heart failure.
Colette Wintle, as I said earlier, you're one of those rare people, a woman who's a haemophiliac. It's passed on through women, but women don't normally themselves get it.
Yes, very unusual, but I inherited the factor 8 deficiency when I started school. I mean, I bled every single day. I had nosebleeds every single day, and they were horrendous. I mean, they would go on for an hour plus. Menstruation was hell. I mean, at the time I was 16, I was massively anemic. For me, just having the haemophilia was a real stigma, and it followed me into adult life. I even lost a job because of it.
John, I'm going to ask you first of all why you chose not to use your real name. Is it to do with your childhood and stigma, that sort of thing?
Absolutely. I've never been public about my HIV status. I was never told don't tell anybody. It was just something you felt you had to do from the nature of what was going on around me.
But that link with HIV only appeared later. When you were a small child, you were simply, if I can use that word, it's not appropriate probably, a haemophiliac. But you went to a, quote, normal school.
I did go to a normal school by the skin of my teeth, with the caveat that I wasn't allowed to use sharp objects. I got my fair share of being picked on for having haemophilia, and I did the one thing that haemophiliacs shouldn't do, and I had a big fight, and that kind of settled that for the rest of my school days.
You won that fight?
I wouldn't say I won. The haemophiliac never wins a fight, not physically, but it set the tone that I would fight back despite everything.
Jeanette Johnson, were you expecting to give birth to a son who had haemophilia?
Well, my father was a haemophiliac, and he was one of 4 boys because it did run in the family. But when Graham was born, they tested him, and yes, I loved him to bits. He was so special. And when he was 2, he fell out of his cot, and the doctors at the haemophilia centre were worried that he may have had a bleed, so they gave him factor 8. But unluckily, it was a bleed on the brain, and he had a clot formed, and it was on the side, so it left him a bit weak on the opposite side.
Peter Jones?
In the early 70s, the majority of people with haemophilia were dead by the time they were 35 years old. And the biggest cause of death was bleeding onto the brain. As well as that, there was this tremendous emphasis on bleeding into joints, and that gives rise to horrible pain. So we were faced with mainly young people, handicapped by the time they were into their teens, with the likelihood of early death.
But there was a great deal of excitement when factor 8 came onto the market, from the States, I think.
Well, the early treatment was actually done in Oxford, and they discovered how to differentiate 2 sorts of haemophilia, one factor 8 deficiency and one factor 9 deficiency. And that was vital because the treatments were different. And then cryoprecipitate came along.
That sounds as if it's frozen, some of it.
Yes, it's a frozen part of the plasma. And that revolutionised the early treatment of haemophilia, because somebody like my patient would come into hospital and have cryoprecipitate instead of plasma. So he wouldn't go into heart failure, and he'd be out of hospital fairly quickly.
David Waters, when you first joined the Haemophilia Society, was knowledge pretty sparse?
Knowledge was pretty sparse, but there was great rejoicing that a medication had been found. I joined in 1981. And it was opening up wonderful horizons for people who were making great career progression, doing things that was never dreamt possible when they were children.
John?
I never actually received cryoprecipitate, as far as I'm aware. We were the first generation to have factor concentrate. It came in a small bottle of powder, and you mixed it with sterile water and you drew it up, and that was your injection. I was taught to inject myself at a very young age. I believe there's actually a bit of film footage of me somewhere doing it on a TV programme for ITV, injecting myself. I think I was about 4 years old, me and another guy who I'm still friends with today. So, as I previously said, when it's a way of life, it was, because we were taught to manage it.
The jump, which John has described, was from cryoprecipitate to concentrate. And the great thing that did was to allow home therapy.
Peter Jones, how early were you aware that there were dangers?
It was well known that there were hepatitis viruses within blood. And we saw patients with abnormal liver function tests from a very early age.
We should, at this stage, perhaps, Peter Jones, make it clear that the way that blood was donated in the United States and in the UK was completely different. In the US, you were paid to give blood, and in this country, it's all done by volunteers. This proved eventually to become pretty significant.
It was very significant indeed. We know perfectly well, historically, that donors who are altruistic, as in the United Kingdom, will very rarely carry the sort of viruses that somebody who is being paid in the United States. And as you heard from the World in Action clip, these are, some of them, drug addicts, alcoholics, Skid Row donors, making the only money they can out of giving their blood. And then, as John has said, the blood has to be pooled, the plasma has to be pooled in order to produce enough factor VIII.
There was the suspicion of hepatitis. It was called non-A, non-B.
Meaning it wasn't either hepatitis A or hepatitis B?
That's right. And it was a very long time before they were able to say conclusively, this is hepatitis C. It was thought that non-A, non-B was a pretty passive hepatitis that wouldn't cause massive danger.
Colette Wintle.
I have a problem with the fact that patients weren't actually told of those issues and they weren't advised that there was risk at any point.
Peter Jones.
The hepatitis risk was considered to be so small and the haemophilia risk so great that the enthusiasm for treatment, as David has said, overcame that.
And I think
John?
That's a real lesson that needs to be learnt and doesn't always get learnt. You know, this pursuit of these fantastic treatments. I completely sympathise with Dr. Jones. It was revolutionary. It did mean I got to live to a great age without having any sort of brain hemorrhages. But doctors back in the 70s and 80s, and still today, they wield a lot of power. And if a doctor says, this is a treatment you have, it wasn't the culture to question what a doctor said. There wasn't a choice. There wasn't a discussion as to this was the drug you're going to have it, and these are the associated risks. My mum does not recall anything of that nature.
It begins, as often as not, with a flu-like fever and sweating at night.
In the early 1980s, a new and mysterious illness struck the United States.
Typically, when the body's immune system is fatally weakened,
it would later become known as autoimmune deficiency syndrome, or AIDS.
And death follows.
How long have you had those stomach pains altogether?
Actually, they started a week ago Wednesday.
Gay men were the first to be identified with the disease. Then injecting drug users were affected, and a number of cases emerged in Haiti.
There have been deaths here, too. Do we already have the hidden seeds of an epidemic here?
Panic and paranoia thrived. Roy Greenslade was then assistant editor of The Sun.
Don't bathe together, don't go in a public swimming pool. In fact, avoid any contact with another human being, especially if that human being you might suspect could be gay.
How many human beings are carrying the virus that kills?
And AIDS sufferers were seen as highly infectious to the touch.
Everyone who went anywhere near someone with AIDS, they were in isolation. All the staff who attended were dressed head to toe in all sorts of weird and wonderful spacesuits.
It was very difficult to get people to clean his room, take the food into his room.
So they think it's in the factor.
Well, yes.
By 1982, speculation began about exactly why some American haemophiliacs had contracted AIDS.
I think everybody's a little scared. Is this the infusion that's going to give it to me? I'm not ready to give up the benefits of concentrate yet.
In August 1983, the first treated British haemophiliac died from AIDS.
We do know from the figures.
Dr. Peter Jones said 20% of his patients in Newcastle were showing signs of the disease.
That AIDS is growing with a magnitude unequalled by any other disease, with the exception of the poliomyelitis epidemic in the 1940s in this country.
Dr. Geoffrey Savage of St Thomas's Hospital in London said there was no alternative to carrying on treatment.
To restrict treatment in these patients is to take away their independent lifestyle, their possibility of gaining employment and holding down employment, their possibilities of having a family, and of being able to offer a sensible contribution to society.
The full scale of the disaster was yet to be revealed.
Well, if you take it at its lowest level, 100 are going to get AIDS.
Dr. Jones again.
If you take it at the highest level, then perhaps 200 of them will get AIDS.
Well, Peter Jones, that was the younger you speaking, and we now know it was 6 times that number.
It was slow progress. And as the disease emerged in the hospitals and clinics, we saw the true extent.
And John, when did you realise that actually the warnings about AIDS began to affect you intimately?
I was 9 or 10, I suppose. This was like the mid-80s, so the TV commercials had started with John Hurt's voiceover and the falling tombstones.
This was warnings about AIDS itself.
Warning about AIDS, don't die of ignorance, all of that sort of stuff. And kids knew I had haemophilia, and one guy just asked me plain, he said, have you got AIDS? And I said, well, no. And I went home and I told my mum, and that's when she told me, well, actually, son, yes, you have. I'm sure it's not how she wanted to tell me, but the opportunity presented itself, and sat down on the sofa and, yep, you've got it. Okay. You got any questions? Yes, but no one can answer that, which was obviously, when am I going to die? Because I knew it was fatal. I knew it was incredibly serious.
At that point, that was what people thought.
Yeah. So I'm 11, 12 years old at this point. So very, very young boy.
Jan Johnson.
The thing I remember is the doctor saying to me one day he'd like to have a word with me. And he said, I'm afraid to say, Janet, the factor 8 could be contaminated and Graham could have contracted HIV or Hep C through it. But I just cried. I thought, what do I do? And I had to go home and take Graham to my mother and tell him at 14 what the doctor had said. And we just sat there crying. And when he went to school, they knew he was a haemophiliac. And he was getting called all sorts of names, the boy with AIDS and Rock Hudson. And he came home one day and told me this, and I just went to the school and I had to complain.
And did you discuss with Graham what might happen to him?
I didn't expect it to happen. I thought, well, he's going to carry on and just live his normal life like he did before.
And Peter Jones, all this time, patients up in your Newcastle practice were coming to you with these sorts of problems. Can you remember the first AIDS patient that you had as a result of infection?
1982. We subsequently tested everybody. Of 99 patients with haemophilia A, that's factor 8 deficiency tested, 78 of our patients were positive. And now 90% of those patients are dead. So that was the extent of disease in this very small, confined group of people.
David Waters?
The situation was extremely difficult. On the one hand, we had doctors, we had our members, and we had our board of directors, each and every one of whom had haemophilia. And we had to listen to what everyone was saying in order to formulate a response. And at the end of the day, our response was that people should continue to receive treatment.
Colette Wintle?
I cannot understand why, for a further 10 years, those commercial pooled plasma products, which were known to carry these horrific diseases, were continued to be used on patients.
The answer, unfortunately, is very simple. There was no alternative, unless we went back to cryoprecipitate, and we know that if you multi-transfuse somebody with haemophilia with cryoprecipitate, they too will get hepatitis.
The most disturbing part of this is that it was mild haemophiliacs who were being given this treatment and exposed to these things, and actually they shouldn't have been.
But there was no alternative.
There was.
There was no alternative until a drug called DDAVP came in.
Yeah.
And the first worry about this drug, which is also called desmopressin, is that you could only give it once. We now know that's not true, but you were in a dilemma again about what that once was to be. Was it to be a brain hemorrhage? Was it to be surgery? Was it to be dental extractions? So you were in difficulty again.
And Colette, your hepatitis affected your prospects of employment.
I had started a nursing career and I was 6 months away from my exams when I contracted hepatitis following the second big exposure at a local hospital in Kent. And I was struggling to continue to do my job when a registrar came along, whom I know, and he actually said to me, "Do you know you're glowing yellow?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Have you been to a doctor?" And I said, 3 GPs. And what did they say? And I said, "They told me I was imagining my patient's symptoms."
And this was a huge liver disease.
Oh, gosh, I was so ill. So I'd lost a vast amount of weight. I was sick. My skin was itching. He said, "You cannot continue. You must go home and I'll take your blood and I'll get you the result." And he phoned me a week later and said, you have got chronic hepatitis B. As soon as the nursing school found out my diagnosis...
Because you were training to be a nurse.
I was training to be a nurse. I was asked to leave with immediate effect, and I was never able to resume my training again. I spent the next 2.5 years trying to recover from this appalling illness before I could resume some form of employment again. And I then went to work for an airline, and I'd signed a permanent contract, and I subsequently was told to pack my bags because they couldn't employ someone with haemophilia. And I did actually come to David Waters at the Society and ask for help, but unfortunately I didn't get any help. But that was further discrimination to me.
David Waters, could you give any advice that was more positive?
I think the fact that I clearly wasn't able to give Colette any helpful advice possibly shows how rare it was for those inquiries to come my way. People were coming for help and advice on financial issues and disability benefit issues and things like that.
Doctors at Great Ormond Street told the coroner that Anthony Thorpe was born in the United States 14 weeks prematurely. He had several blood transfusions, and 3 weeks ago he was rushed to Great Ormond Street with severe pneumonia.
Haemophiliacs weren't the only ones at risk from infected American blood.
Almost at once, doctors discovered he had AIDS, for which there's no known treatment.
The baby's death in early 1985 raised fears of the same thing happening in Britain.
If you needed to have a transfusion of blood, would you be at all frightened at the moment?
No, I wouldn't.
The Health Secretary, Kenneth Clarke, assured the BBC's Nick Ross that British blood supplies were much safer than American ones.
Everybody in the medical world knows it's a dangerous disease. Don't get panicked into thinking you're going to catch it in some curious way when you're in hospital or anyone near anybody who's affected.
But just days later, those reassurances seemed misplaced.
A blood donor whose blood was given to 51 people has died from the disease AIDS in a Bournemouth hospital. The medical authorities say none of those who've been given his blood has AIDS, and there's only a slight risk that they will develop the disease.
Most of the recipients were haemophiliacs. Others included a toddler and a pregnant mother.
The people who've been given AIDS-contaminated blood will have to wait for up to 5 years before they know whether they've got the disease or not.
But the discovery of the virus that causes AIDS, HIV, meant that scientists could now develop a test for it.
Last Friday, the Department of Health estimated that 2,500 haemophiliacs have been infected by the AIDS virus as a result of using imported factor VIII.
Haemophiliacs were dealt a further blow in the early 1990s.
From today, all Britain's blood donors will be tested for the Hepatitis C virus. Doctors estimate that 1 in 2,000 people are carriers of this recently discovered strain, which can cause headaches and, in severe cases, chronic liver disease.
Testing eventually revealed that nearly 5,000 haemophiliacs in Britain had contracted the disease from NHS treatment.
Once I found out I'd got it, every time I had a blood test, they put hazardous signs over it. So, I'd gone through all those years not knowing I'd got the illness, and I could have passed it on to other people.
Dr. Peter Jones, there's a great deal of fear, obviously, and doctors would agree that they were in many ways just as ignorant about what might happen as everybody else. How did you cope with all the questions your patients were asking you when they came to your clinic?
Very straightforwardly, very pragmatically. They looked to us, obviously, for advice about their treatment and their future. Now, we weren't working in a vacuum. We were working with the Hemophilia Society and with colleagues across the world, particularly in America and Australia. So their knowledge was pooled knowledge from all these sources, and we told them the truth.
The truth was that their treatment could actually make them iller than they were already.
Oh, yes. And we had group meetings. We even had weekends where, unfortunately, they were subjected to lectures, but then in the evening they could let their hair down and they could ask us anything. And we answered to the best of our knowledge. I used to take between 40 and 50 phone calls a night at the height of this from newspapers, particularly in the United Kingdom. At home, yeah.
What were you able to tell the people who came to you, David Waters, at the Society in your leaflets? I mean, presumably as soon as they were printed, they were becoming out of date?
They were almost out of date before they hit the post. They were called Hemofact leaflets, and people used to ring up and say, I've got it, but I don't want to read it because I know it'll be more bad news.
What progress was being made scientifically in the treatment by this stage? We're in the mid-80s going up to the 90s.
We're heading very rapidly towards heat treatment and things like this, which was found to eliminate viruses.
It's the same as pasteurising milk to make it safe. So if you heated it for long enough at a high enough temperature, it worked, and it removed the HIV.
Did you deal with a lot of anger, David Waters?
People were understandably and totally justifiably extremely angry about what was happening to their lives and their futures. And we conveyed that at every opportunity to the government.
At that time, was there any question of compensation?
Yes, we were on the road to discussing compensation, which was a word the government didn't particularly like because it had implications. And I remember being in a meeting with the then Minister of Health, John Moore, and he said, how many people do you think are affected here? Because we'd been saying, this is a contained problem. It's not a massive, limitless problem. And we plucked the figure 1,200 from the air, and that figure turned out to be just slightly on the low side, possibly, but 1,200 is the ballpark figure.
John, Colette has described vividly how difficult it was for her to be accepted in various jobs, from nursing to working as part of cabin crew on an airline. How about you?
Well, I've never had a job. As I was getting towards sort of like my mid-teens, I was starting to develop the symptoms of AIDS, lots of chest problems, losing weight and going through various treatment. But I carried on, I stayed in school, just about scraping to university health-wise, and I had about a semester there.
What were you studying?
Engineering. So potentially on another life I could have had a really nice career. But looking back with hindsight, I think I'd started to give up on any future probably as young as the age of 14 or 15, because by then I knew what AIDS was, I knew what the prognosis was. I certainly wasn't planning a career, I wasn't envisaging a family, I wasn't envisaging children. When I had to stop university, that was pretty much then 3 to 4 years of essentially waiting to die. So by this point, all ambitions of a life, they're completely gone.
And however tough that life was for John, Jeanette, your son Graham didn't get that far.
Yeah, and he became really ill and had to go into hospital, and he was in there a couple of weeks, and I just got a phone call one day, could you just come in, Janet, because he'd had treatment while he was in there for factor VIII and all sorts, and when I got there, Graham had died. And it just broke my heart because I just didn't expect it. He was always happy. He was never complaining, and it's just terrible. It was so sad because I have a daughter, and it was 2 days before Sharon's 12th birthday, and I had to come home and tell her that your brother's died. And Sharon's a nurse now, and I think that's why, because of Graham. But it was terrible afterwards. I was having the press phone me up and ask, did you share the same cutlery as your son? Because you shouldn't do things like that. And I was just so angry.
This was a time of maximum prejudice against AIDS sufferers.
Yeah.
There was a lot of kindness, I think, that's shown to you, and helpfulness.
One of the doctors spoke at my son's funeral and invited us to a barbecue at his house. And also at the back of the hospital, Churchill Hospital, where he died, there was a nature reserve where I used to take him for a walk. And we had the ashes buried there, and the doctor, Matthews, he came with us, and my son loved nature. He could have been David Attenborough. And the night he died was frosty, and I was laid in bed, and all of a sudden a butterfly appeared. And That's my my comfort.
And Colette, how about you at this period? There was a test for hepatitis specifically, which would have interested you very much.
Yes. By the late 80s, I was more than alert to the connection between the treatment I'd been given and the fact that I'd contracted 2 different types of hepatitis. So I think what alarmed me was that despite the fact that I retrospectively discovered that there had been communication between my GP and the hospital discussing my non-A, non-B status, which I had not been told about, I wasn't tested until 1991, and indeed I wasn't told until quite a number of months after I had married my husband.
Does that surprise you, Peter Jones?
Yes, it does. I think it's wrong.
Is it infectious, potentially?
Yes, it is, and it can be sexually transmitted, although that's rare. So everybody should have been informed.
Yeah, but unfortunately it was quite commonplace.
Yeah, very similar experience to myself.
John?
I was not informed of my hepatitis C status. I actually asked, have I had this? And, oh yeah. Well, I wasn't told. Oh, well, it's not causing any problems, is it? Was kind of the response. It's only in the last couple of years that I've managed to get hold of my records and had them reviewed, that in my childhood, while I was at the Children's Hospital, I did have an acute phase of hepatitis C. And when I was transferred to the adult hospital, they certainly treated me as if I had hepatitis C. I did not know any of this. My mum did not know any of this. So I've been quite fortunate in that hepatitis C hasn't caused me some of the problems that a lot of the other people have. I haven't advanced to cirrhosis or anything like that. So, I'm very thankful for that. But I needed to know from a safety perspective, from transmission, all of that sort of stuff.
The thing that concerns me is how you go through life as somebody with severe haemophilia where you should be followed up regularly. One of the bits of follow-up is to do the liver function tests, and then to tell the patient what the liver function tests show. And because of that link between hepatitis of whatever sort and the liver function tests, all the patients should know what's going on.
But I have to say, on the whole, having met many, many haemophiliacs over quite a number of years now, that was not the case.
2 years ago, Tony Newton, who was then Minister of Health, set up a fund of some £10 million to help these most unfortunate people.
In 1989, a group legal action was launched. The government repeatedly denied liability for the disaster. The junior health minister at the time was Roger Freeman.
Whilst we recognise the human tragedy involved, we don't believe the department was negligent, and therefore any kind of out-of-court settlement is not appropriate.
Researchers were told that government records relating to the disaster had been shredded. David Owen discovered his own ministerial papers were among them.
I think we will find that there was a decision taken somewhere to completely clean the files and not leave it open to other ministers or senior civil servants to be taken to court on this issue. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but I think the crisis came when Laurent Fabius, the former French Prime Minister but Minister of Health, was taken to court for his actions on this issue in France. And many people got pretty close to being put in jail. I think a collective panic hit ministries of health all over the world, and there was a clampdown. I hope I'm wrong in this. I have no proof of it. But the circumstances are really very, very extraordinary.
Tomorrow, a controversial inquiry sets out to discover what went wrong. But it isn't a proper public inquiry. Successive governments have resisted attempts to hold anyone to account.
The Archer inquiry, led by the former Solicitor General Peter Archer, was privately funded and sought to establish what went wrong.
The inquiry heard harrowing evidence of how contaminated American blood products led to the deaths of nearly 2,000 British haemophiliacs.
But its report, published in 2009, fell short of apportioning blame.
Today, the first ever official inquiry into the disaster recommended large-scale testing.
The Scottish Parliament did agree to a public inquiry, chaired by Lord Penrose.
Tory whitewash.
It's a whitewash.
The final report, with its lack of concrete recommendations, bitterly disappointed many of the campaigners.
Afterwards, the charity Hemophilia Scotland had to appeal for CAM.
We owe it to all of those who have died and those whose lives have been turned upside down and continue to be every day of life,
That afternoon, on the 23rd of March last year, the Prime Minister David Cameron made the first official apology to victims.
It is difficult to imagine the feelings of unfairness that people must feel at being infected with something like hepatitis C or HIV as a result of a totally unrelated treatment within the NHS. And to each and every one of those people, I would like to say sorry on behalf of the government for something that should not have happened.
Colette, you and your family have gone through an awful lot, as have the families of other people round this table. Do you look at it now, this infection of blood to help haemophiliacs, as a natural accident or total medical negligence?
Negligence by public bodies, absolutely. There is such a strong body of evidence out there now which clearly points to where negligence took place.
Peter Jones, do you accept that criticism?
That is totally wrong. I have been through 2 years while I was working of litigation, and then more recently we've been through 3 more years with the General Medical Council of being accused of all sorts of malpractice in the care of our patients. None of them have turned up anything to suggest negligence. We're faced now with a small group who are still extremely angry for obvious reasons, but within those groups are people who are so self-centred and so manipulative that they can continue to pretend there is going to be a favourable response to compensation. So this
But are you saying compensation is a chimera, that they will never receive the right sort of compensation?
I don't think they ever will receive what is the right sort of compensation.
How much were doctors affected by the distressing things that happened to their patients?
Very badly. There are rumours of suicides. There's certainly depression. My own family, my nursing staff, very badly affected. And the reason that we've come through it is because we work as teams and support each other.
Do you accept that, Colette?
No, and I'm quite stunned by that, because what the suffering you're talking about pales into insignificance to what's happened to the haemophilia community. And I'm wondering, are you suggesting that Lord Archer of Sandwell's conclusions on the independent inquiry were wrong, where he was quite clear that commercial interests were put well ahead of public safety? And he set a number of recommendations out there which the government could easily have adopted and put in place, which would have recognised the needs and losses of victims of this.
Were you not encouraged by what David Cameron said at his last Prime Minister's questions, that would be a new fund of £125 million extra support for people who'd been victims in this way?
It's hard to be encouraged when you've been forced to live from a begging bowl, and £125 million is a considerably small amount of money when you look at what people have actually lost.
Peter Jones.
I'm sorry to have to say, but in my opinion, the Archer report was useless. The evidence that was given was non-adversarial. It was not taken under oath. It wasn't a legal process, and I know from experience that some people who gave evidence at that inquiry lied. You can have all the reasons that Colette gives for why they want money, but they're now doing harm, not only to themselves, in my opinion, but also to the new generation of people with haemophilia who are growing up with their families, and they're faced at all meetings of the Haemophilia Society with this anger, and it should be dissipated by
Well, if
now.
they're not to get money as compensation, what would you suggest they did get then?
Well, I don't.
An apology?
Well, of course they should have an apology. We've apologised and apologised and apologised, and David Cameron apologised twice.
Yes, but he did say for something that should not have happened.
Well, of course it shouldn't have happened, but it did.
John, what's your view on this? You're still very much with us after all these years.
I am still
Thanks
with you.
to better treatment for AIDS.
Yes, thanks to better treatment for AIDS. I'm staggered by some of the things that Peter Jones has just said. Archer was not useless. It's a pretty horrific thing to say, especially in the company you're in. Shame on you. The reason we had to have Archer is because the British government has repeatedly and continues to refuse to have a full public inquiry where people are compelled to attend under oath. Archer was our only attempt at that. As Colette said, if the Archer recommendations had been carried through, the anger would have dissipated. We wouldn't be bothering the Haemophilia Society with our anger and ruining it for the next generation. How dare you say that?
David Waters, what's your view?
There can be absolutely no doubt that people with haemophilia have had their lives decimated, hopes dashed, promising futures denied, and successive governments have indeed failed them.
Janet Johnson? Would money have made a difference to you?
Well, it doesn't bring someone back, but yeah, it would help.
And what's the position now with haemophiliacs, Peter Jones? Can you say that they will, as a result of the distressing experience of all these people, have a good chance of leading a reasonably decent life without getting an infection from their blood that they're given?
Yes, because we've moved on to recombinant, that is genetically engineered factor 8 and factor 9, and prophylaxis, which is preventing bleeding in the first place. And so, once again, the hopes are very high.
Could it happen again?
Yes, it could happen again. The HIV epidemic sprang from a new pathogen. It wasn't there before, and there was no way you could have legislated or done anything about that at the time. And all we can do is to keep our surveillance the highest it possibly can be.
John?
There is a lot of anger, I perfectly acknowledge that. I don't have that level of anger towards the actual physicians who treated me. We've heard that they were in a difficult position. My real anger stems from a risk was taken, but nobody thought, what if the risk materialises? And in any decision, especially one as big as what people are treated with, what medications they're treated with, that should always have been a very big discussion. And certainly what followed, the car crashes of different schemes, support, was the reaction. Whereas when it all happened back in 1985 and they realised the vast extent of it, somebody had gone, yeah, we got that badly wrong, here is compensation, whatever, we wouldn't be sat where we are today.
Dr. Peter Jones, David Waters, Colette Wintle, Jan Johnson and John, thank you all very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
The Reunion was produced by Deborah Dudgeon. The series producer is David Prest, and it was a Whistledown production for BBC.